Welcome, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I am Christina Ewig. I'm the faculty director of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy here at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Our event today, Mexico's Path to Abortion Decriminalization, is co-hosted with two other partners here at the University of Minnesota, the Human Rights Program and the Interdisciplinary Center on Global Change. And I want to thank these partners for working with us to organize today's event. I also want to begin our event today by acknowledging that we live, learn, and work each day on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary land of Indigenous peoples. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on Dakota land, ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. Sometimes these land acknowledgements seem like window dressing, but I think it's especially important today because we are in Indigenous Peoples Month in the United States. And it's important when we talk about issues of human rights and women's rights like we will today, because European settlement and exploitation have shaped our social and legal context here in Minnesota and also in Mexico, though of course in different ways. In terms of our topic today, on September 7th, Mexico's Supreme Court ruled that it is unconstitutional to punish abortion as a crime. This is a major policy change for one of the world's largest Catholic countries, where abortion was previously allowed only in 4 states and Mexico City. Ironically, this decision coincided with legislation that has effectively shut down abortion providers just across the border in the state of Texas. So, how did Mexico arrive at this landmark decision? Will Mexican states abide by this federal ruling? And what has been the reaction in Mexico to this decision by the Catholic Church? And what have been the reactions of Mexican social movements on both the left and the right? To answer these questions and more, I have the great pleasure of having 2 distinguished guests join us today. We have with us Ms. Melissa Ayala, who is the coordinator of the litigation area of the Mexican non-governmental organization Grupo de Información en Reproducción Elegida, or Information Group on Reproductive Choice, also known as GIRE, located in Mexico City. GIRE is a feminist organization that works in human rights and one of the principal organizations that has spearheaded the fight for abortion rights over the long term in Mexico. Ms. Ayala is an attorney that specializes in constitutional law, feminist legal theory, and human rights. She earned her law degree at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, or ITAM, and her LLM at Harvard. Her work has focused on the defense of sexual and reproductive rights, the eradication of political violence based on gender, and the development of tools to eradicate sexual harassment and harassment in universities and workplaces. We also have with us Dr. Camilla Reuterswärd. Dr. Reuterswärd is an assistant professor in the governance cluster at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. She was previously a postdoctoral fellow in the Scripps Cluster of Excellence at the Free University of Berlin and earned her PhD in political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2019. Her research focuses on the politics of abortion and same-sex marriage in Mexico and Latin America more broadly. She is currently working on a book on the subnational politics of abortion and same-sex marriage in Mexico. Before I move into our conversation, a couple little housekeeping details. The chat function is disabled, but please use the Q&A function to ask your questions of the speakers. I will check them throughout our conversation and do my best to present them into our conversation. Live transcription has been enabled through Zoom for this event, and a video recording will be available on YouTube early next week. Okay, now let me turn to our questions. I would like to first start with Melissa and ask that before we get into the details of this Supreme Court decision in September, can you set the stage for us by describing the consequences of criminalization of abortion in Mexico? For example, prior to this decision, how many women were injured or died from illegal abortions? What would happen to women that sought healthcare after an abortion? Were women who sought abortion imprisoned, for example? Paint us a picture of the pre-decision context in Mexico.
Thank you, Christina. First of all, I'm deeply honored to be here. I really appreciate this invitation in the name of GIRE. We are thrilled to be here, and I'm really happy to be speaking with such a dear colleague as is Camilla. Before going live, we were talking about how she has worked with GIRE before, so thank you very much for this space. Regarding your first question, I think that what criminalization did, or the fact that abortion is considered a crime in our country, in Mexico, the first impact that this has is it creates a chilling effect. What does this mean? What do I mean when I say this? A lot of women and people with the ability to gestate go into different sort of measures to have an abortion with medication, for example. And when they go, when something happens, they don't go to the hospitals. Why? Because we know in GIRE, and we have released writings, and we have presented a lot of things with this data. We know that the doctors, nurses are the first who tell the police that a woman or a person with the ability to gestate is having an abortion. And they call the police comes, and even when the woman is still bleeding or they are still at risk, their health is still at risk, they ask them questions, and they force them to tell that they had performed an abortion. So even though, for example, these declarations go against our rights, since, you know, every person has a right to have an attorney when they are being questioned, still the police go and perform these interrogatories. So I would say that's the first effect that the criminalization has. We don't have certain data that tells us how many women have been imprisoned for abortion, because there are a lot of gaps in our access to information. For example, we don't know, it isn't desegregated by sex. So, for example, if we ask the authority who is in charge of access to information, how many women are in prison for having an abortion, they will give us a number, but it will include as well men, you know? So there could be men who made women have an abortion without their consent in those numbers. So there is no fiable data, you know? So that's something that we are still working to a gap we are still working to close. And that's one of the things we are so happy to share with you today, is that yesterday we released our latest report. I will send it to you because we also have it in English. Here is the report. It's quite big, if you can see it. But here we have documented all of these things, how the fact that it's still considered a crime, it doesn't even serve the objective that the Congresses have by criminalizing. We know that Congresses, local Congresses, put abortion in their criminal codes as a way to avoid women and persons with the ability to gestate to perform an abortion. But the only thing that the result of this criminalization is that women continue to have abortions in unsanitary conditions that only put them and their reproductive future at risk.
And maybe that's a good point to jump in and ask Camilla to give us some background, because for those that aren't familiar with Mexico, it is a federal system. So abortion, this is a decision at the national level, but abortion is then regulated at the state level. Camilla, before this decision, what was the landscape in terms of which states had already decriminalized abortion, and which states were most resistant to decriminalization? Can you give us some background on that?
Absolutely, and I also want to take the opportunity, just as Melissa, and say thank you for inviting me to this seminar. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. But as for your question, Christina, so as you already alluded to, so Mexico is a federal system where each state has jurisdiction to determine their abortion policy. So we see quite a lot of variation. But it's also good to know that prior to the decriminalization, all Mexican states actually did, at least in theory, allow abortion in the case of rape. And the majority also permitted it in cases of fetal malformation, or when the woman's the risk of her life or health has been in danger, right? So that's sort of the general landscape, and that legislation has been in place for many, many years. What happened following Mexico City's decriminalization of abortion in 2007 is that we saw so many states, 18 out of Mexico's 32, enacting these right to life amendments that in fact did not change abortion policies, but created this atmosphere of fear that you would be prosecuted for abortion, as Melissa just talked about. So in effect, what happened was that most people still perceived abortion to be illegal, and that's how it's been interpreted in states, because we see that there are a lot of women being incarcerated for abortion. But what has happened now, and most recently during this year, has been that we have seen a wave of liberalizations, actually. So already prior to the Supreme Court's verdict in September, we had a number of states, including amongst them Hidalgo, Veracruz. I think we also had Baja California just a couple of weeks ago, and Oaxaca already back in 2019. So we have in total, if you also count Mexico City back in 2007, and Coahuila, the state that actually, whose abortion laws struck down now through the Supreme Court, and is now, where abortion now is not legal, is now legal or decriminalized. So we see that in total 6 states have now in effect decriminalized abortion. And the rest of the states, many of them still have these right to life amendments in place, but those were also struck down by the Supreme Court's verdict. So there's a lot of things going on. So in effect, we see a wave of restrictive reforms and now also a wave of liberalizing reforms.
That's fascinating. So that helps us then maybe to understand there's some different lead up to this Supreme Court decision. And so I'd like to now ask Melissa to break that decision down for us and maybe start with telling us what is the difference between, and is there a difference between decriminalization and legalization? And then break down the decision for us. What does the decision mean? What does it mean immediately? Does there still need to be litigation moving forward in the different Mexican states, or what will that look like? But first, what's the difference between decriminalization and legalization?
Great. I think that's a great question, Christina, because sometimes both terms are mixed up and most people could believe that it's the same when there is a slight difference. When we talk about decriminalization, we talk about having abortion taken out of the criminal code. When we talk about legalization, we talk about how it will be regulated, as in where can you have an abortion, until what weeks. I mean, everything that needs to be stated or regulated, it's around the legalization. So there's a fine difference, but there is, Now, going into the decisions of the Supreme Court, I will try to do my best to explain these decisions, because these are both Sinaloa and Coahuila's decision, I think must be addressed today. In its first decision, which is an action of inconstitutionality action, the Mexican Supreme Court unanimously recognized a constitutional right to legal, safe, and free abortion services at the initial stages of pregnancy, as well as in other situations outlined by the Supreme Court. Therefore, laws that criminalize abortion in all circumstances are unconstitutional. While the Supreme Court recognized that there is a state interest in the protection of fetal development that increases over the course of pregnancy, it emphasized that such interest may not trump the reproductive rights of women and other individuals with gestational capacity, such as, for example, trans persons or non-binary individuals. As a direct result of this decision, several portions of the criminal code of the state of Coahuila were struck down, and women who had been imprisoned in that state in particular for having procured abortions were freed. I checked before our webinar, and the state of Coahuila said that there was no women and no individual with gestational capacity imprisoned until now. So that's a good thing. And also, an impact of this decision is that no person may be tried or sanctioned in Mexico under criminal codes that do not recognize the right to terminate a pregnancy. So this is also something really, really big, something really important. Let me add that no other constitutional court in Latin America has recognized such expansive rights, as rulings by other courts in the region have recognized the right to have an abortion only in limited situations, such as when the life and the health of a woman is at risk. And this decision goes further, even, let me add, this decision goes further even than Roe versus Wade, for example, this major decision in the United States. Why? Because here we recognize that economic barriers to reproductive rights and reproductive services must also be addressed in order to guarantee the right to health. And just because we already talked about also the decision from Sinaloa, let me just talk a little bit about it. In a second decision, the Supreme Court ruled that states do not have the authority, that local states do not have the authority under the Mexican federal system to establish a right to life from the moment of conception in their local constitutions. What does this mean? Or how can I translate this? What the justices said is that only the general constitution may establish what constitutes a person entitled to fundamental rights. The court in this decision also held that states may not grant embryos or fetuses the same legal protection accorded to persons, recognizing that such measures are aimed at limiting reproductive rights, particularly abortion rights. So I think that both decisions are of a huge impact, and that I mean, we still have a lot of work to be done, because this doesn't mean that all states have abolished the crime of abortion from their criminal codes. The decision of the Supreme Court only means that judges from both local and federal judicial systems cannot imprison women or other people with the ability to gestate. However, the crime remains in the criminal codes of the states. And as Camilla already said, this generates an idea that abortion continues to be a crime. Because I don't know if this is the same in the United States, but here in Mexico, unfortunately, not every person knows what the Supreme Court has said. I mean, a lot of the local authorities I have worked with don't understand the decision of the court. For example, we just had a case in Baja California Sur where the policemen were trying to imprison a woman who had a spontaneous abortion. And they had no clue, that even the local judge had no clue about the impact of the Supreme Court's decision. And just let me finish with something. Even though we are talking today about these decisions haven't been published. So we don't know how we will have the final text. And this is something really important. We are talking about how we're talking about the things that the justices said in the court. We're talking about the first draft that we saw that was published in the Supreme Court website, but we still don't have the final ruling. So we still have to be looking forward for what the justices will deliver in their decisions.
Fascinating. Okay, so you said a couple of different things. I wanted to clarify for a US audience that may not be familiar with the spontaneous abortion as a term, but that's a miscarriage. So someone being arrested for having a miscarriage would be what people might be more familiar with. And so it sounds like, on the one hand, the legal decision would force states to change their constitutions, but on the other hand, it sounds like that may not be such an easy process. So I wonder, for either one of you who would like to jump in, what are you anticipating in terms of the future, the next steps that will be taken at the federal level by different states? Will they be automatically saying, okay, once they hear about the decision, will they be automatically going and revising those constitutions? Or is there going to be debate at the state level about this? How clear are the steps forward?
Okay, I'll jump in here if I may. Great. So I think this is sort of the $1,000,000 question right now. So what's going to happen in the rest of the states? Because as you said, Christina, and Melissa clarified, this decision doesn't mean that abortion is decriminalized all across Mexico. It is decriminalized as of now in Coahuila, right? And of course, the Sinaloa ruling as well matters. And the question is then, what's going to happen? And so my perhaps a bit pessimistic take on this is that I do think that we are going to see some kind of a backlash. And it's interesting because this ruling has some similarities with the Supreme Court ruling back in 2015, when it ruled that it was unconstitutional for states to not legalize same-sex marriage. And what happened then was that we did see progress, but it took a long time. So it took a number of years and a lot of amparos before several states then actually changed their legislation. But it isn't really until in the most recent years that we have seen a lot of states actually changing their same-sex marriage laws, or actually expanding heterosexual marriage to homosexual couples. And so what I think is going to happen in the case of abortion is that we're going to see some kind of a backlash. The question is exactly how this will play out and at what government level. So will there be some kind of pushback at the federal level first and then trickling down to the subnational, or will it start at the subnational? So following Mexico City's decriminalization in 2007, I already mentioned that we saw this wave of right to life reforms. Clearly, this type of ruling that we've seen now is quite different. So it struck down rather than validated a decision which it made, which it did in the case of Mexico City. And so that means that a lot of states will not be able to sort of very quickly try to hinder the spread of a liberalization as they did back in 2007. And I think the big issue here is how creative opponents can actually become. So drawing a parallel to the US, I think what we might expect to see is this kind of piecemeal legislation that occurred after Roe v. Wade. So we would see the sort of slow kind of chipping away, trying to undermine the court ruling, but it also set very clear parameters. Like, states are not allowed to penalize abortion anymore. So what will opponents try to do instead? So will we see, for example, heartbeat bills coming to the fore in Mexico? I think it's all about sort of how innovative and quick opponents are in terms of legislating against this court decision. And what we saw back in 2007 is that opponents were quite quick. These right to life amendments spread rather quickly, just about a year after the Supreme Court verdict. But perhaps, Melissa, you might have a more positive take on this, but that's my sort of initial thoughts.
And if I could just sort of, if Melissa or Camilla, if you could lay out, so who is the opposition in Mexico? I'm assuming it's Catholic Church, I'm assuming it's right-wing parties. Who would be orchestrating the potential backlash that Camilla is talking about?
Yes, I think that Camila points out something that we are all dreading. We are all uh, hoping doesn't happen, but we have to be ready if it happens. As she said, we experienced a really strong backlash after 2007 with the decision in the Supreme Court that said that it was constitutional the way that Mexico City decriminalized abortion. And answering to your specific question, Christina, I think that the opposition would be the right movement, of course. The Here in Mexico, we call them the anti-rights movement because we don't like to tell them pro-life because we are all pro-life. The thing is that people who are in favor of abortion, we are in favor of having a life with dignity, of women having a life that they choose. So we call them anti-rights. I think those are the major opposition. Of course, Catholic Church. After the landmark decision delivered by the Supreme Court, there was a priest in Coahuila who said that all women who wanted to have abortion should be murdered. So that's one of the things. That's why we don't call them pro-life. Because imagine a priest saying that he's in favor of killing all of the women that want to have an abortion. And I think all of you know the situation that's going in Mexico with the feminicides. So it's incredibly stupid, let me put it that way, for someone to be saying this. So I think that the Catholic Church is one of the greatest opponents of women having their autonomy and reproductive rights guaranteed. But also we have seen political parties who represent the far right, who are our main opposition. So and following up with what Camila just said, I'm feeling kind of optimistic. I hope it's okay, but I think that our main concern could be the conscientious objection by medical personnel. We also had a decision from the Supreme Court where the court shut down. Well, they didn't shut down. They said that how it was regulated, the right to conscientious objection by medical personnel was unconstitutional because it didn't establish the limits necessary to ensure patients' rights to healthcare. So the Supreme Court issued an exhortation to the legislative branch of government so that the exercise of this right of the conscientious objection in the medical system may be properly regulated. Currently, we don't have no regulation because the court said that it was unconstitutional. So I think that's also one of my biggest fears, that women will start going to the medical facilities, to hospitals, and ask for an abortion, and there won't be personnel who can provide the service. So I think that the next step will be to ensure that all women and all individuals with the ability to become pregnant or to gestate can access to this service in a way that's with empathy, but also by personnel that has the ability to do these procedures. I think that's one of my biggest concerns right now.
Camilla, did you want to add in terms of what you might foresee in terms of backlash, and how similar or different would it be to the same-sex marriage ruling? I mean, it seems like that might be the better parallel, given it's a Supreme Court decision. Why don't you go ahead and...
Right. So I think if we're thinking about the parallel to same-sex marriage, I think perhaps taking the edge of all the negative things that I was foreseeing, because what we do see with same-sex marriage is that eventually states had to comply, whether or not that was through votes in the legislature or through amparos, so these constitutional appeals, right? So eventually it did happen, but it took a number of years. So in that scenario, we might expect states to go ahead and comply with this decision, but it might take a while. But on that note, I also want to say that the picture isn't perhaps as gloomy as I painted it, because we do see with these recent liberalizations that there are things happening. And a lot of that seems to be because we have Morena now, this party that identifies as left-wing, and was largely the creation of AMLO, right? Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is Mexico's current president, for those who didn't know, but I think most people do know. And so basically in almost all of the states that have liberalized or decriminalized abortion during this last year, we have seen that Morena has been the party that has, crafted this legislation, actually passed it. And so that seems to indicate that there are also parties and forces in Mexico who are trying to make abortion more accessible. And I think knowing about party politics in Mexico, Morena might be using this as a strategy to differentiate itself from other parties such as the PAN and the PRI that have largely played a big role in enacting these kinds of very restrictive and conservative policies when it comes to reproductive health. So that might be something that they would like to continue pushing for in the states where they have the mandates or the seats to do so.
So let me interject a little bit here. Feminists in Mexico, in my understanding, don't see López Obrador as a particular friend. We've seen repression of feminists most recently and protests over feminicide and other issues by his government. Yet you're saying Morena at the state level is promoting these. How do I understand those two things happening at the same time? Who would like to take that one on? Is Morena very different at the local level, or and how do we explain it?
I would say that Morena at the local level has been very different from what we see from our president. Let me add that, for example, all of the, if I'm not wrong, all of the states where decriminalization has occurred in the last year, they had a majority of Morena Congress. The Congress was a majority of Morena. So I think that Morena in the states is different from Morena in the federal system, and I really don't know how to explain this this difference between the federal Morena and the local Morena, because at the end of the day, López Obrador, our president, is the main figure in this political party, However, something that I might add is that even in the executive branch, in the federal executive branch, we have seen feminist allies in there. For example, there is the Center for Reproductive Health, which is led by a longtime feminist ally. So there's that, even though the president, who is the major figure in the executive branch, is not, feminists are not his favorite persons in the world, we have a lot of allies in the federal executive government.
So we have a follow-up question from an audience member. Barb Fry, who leads our human rights program here, asks, so how do we square the Morena's lack of action on feminicide with their support of abortion rights? How would you answer that? Why one and not the other, or is that a misinterpretation?
I would say that women are not, and if I'm wrong, Camila, please feel free to correct me. I think that for Morena, women are not their main audience. So currently, abortion, it's a key topic. It's a topic everybody is talking about in Mexico because of the green tide, because of the feminist social movements, and because of the Supreme Court decision. So in a way, we have as NGOs and social movements, we have forced the political party to in the states to deliver an answer, and I'm not saying that feminicides is not the movement to eradicate feminicides in Mexico isn't as the movement isn't as strong as, for example, the green side in Mexico. I'm just saying that in this exact moment, a lot of things have come together for the local states to address abortion in this way. But let me be really clear. We are just talking about Morena decriminalizing abortion, which means only taking the crime of abortion away from criminal codes. I think this is easier to do than eradicating gender-based violence, such as feminicides. Because when we're talking about feminicides, we have a lot of laws that say that feminicides should be prosecuted in this way. We have a landmark decision by the Supreme Court, the case of Mariana Lima Buendia, in which the Supreme Court says how cases that regarding feminicides must be investigated, prosecuted. But this is, when we talk about feminicides, we're also talking about something much more structural. I think that we are all familiar with the cases of the Muertas de la Ciudad Juárez. It's something that goes really back, So I think that even though we appreciate that Morena and the local states are doing this decriminalization, that's just one little step towards the reproductive justice.
So that brings us really to this question of social movements. I'd like you both to elaborate a bit more in terms of to what degree this decision is tied to feminist mobilization in Mexico and feminist mobilization across the region. Melissa, you just sort of drew a distinction between the movement in Mexico for feminicide and the movement for abortion rights. We've seen those really come together, especially in Argentina, for example, that recently in December of 2020 legalized abortion, where the Ni Una Menos movement against feminicide reframed and saw deaths due to abortion as a similar and parallel to deaths due to gender-based violence. But okay, returning back, so how much do feminist movements in Mexico and region-wide how much do you think that has mattered for this Supreme Court decision?
I can start us off, but I do think that Melissa has a better idea of this. I mean, I think we have seen a huge change in terms of activism in favor of abortion liberalization in Mexico. So a couple of years back, especially just after the Mexico City decriminalization, there was not a whole lot of activity going on in the States. There's always been a lot of mobilization in Mexico City, but beyond Mexico City, there hasn't been that much. And it's certainly not enough to try to sort of hold back these anti-rightist forces. I think that is changing to some extent. I do think that there's a lot of variation in terms of the extent of mobilization across the country. And I also think that there's wide variation in terms of how much this mobilization actually matters for political parties. So in most of my research, my conclusion has been that social mobilization, especially in part on feminist and public opinion as well, has not mattered particularly much for a lot of political parties. In some cases, yes, especially, for example, for the PRD in Mexico City back in 2007, but overall, not so much. What I think we see now is more mobilization, more younger women, younger feminists coming out on the streets and actually not being scared of actually just taking to violence if that is what they think is required. And in terms of other movements, I do think that there is some sort of inspiration and motivation coming from other movements, especially from Argentina, where these movements actually have, you can see the results, like their activism has borne fruit. I'm not entirely clear on how much that mobilization has influenced the court per se. But I think, yeah, I'll give the floor to Melissa, who I think might have a better idea.
I would say that this decision was deeply moved by this feminist social movement. Why? Because a lot of the people that work with the justices are part, well, not a lot, but some people, some women that work with justices are feminists. And when they go out of the court, when they finish their I don't know, 9 to 5 work hours, they go and they wear their green scarf. So the fact that we have feminist allies within the Supreme Court's doors, I think has changed as well the vision of the justices. So I think that's something really good. And also, I think that feminism in Mexico has become something like pop culture, something more mainstream than before. I remember when I was growing up, the only representation I had from abortion is this film, The Crime of Father Amaro, in which, just to sum it up, a girl gets pregnant by the priest, and the priest takes her to have an illegal, unsanitary abortion, and she dies. So that was the only representation I had growing up of what abortion looked like. But today, thanks to Netflix and all of all the pop culture, we know that abortion can be a responsible decision, that we have other women that are accompanying the abortion process, and the fact that you can have abortion with medication, it revolutionized everything. So the justices don't exist in a bubble, So the fact that they are also seeing this, and they have people that work with them, are talking about the green tide. They have daughters who are and sons who are talking about the green tide, and they are seeing the mobilizations, and they work in a place where a lot of manifestations go through, So they are in the core, they're in the heart of Mexico City, seeing what is happening to women and how they are being criminalized for protesting, for saying for saying ni una menos, So the fact that everything, all of this is happening, I think that has also had an impact to the justices. And also, I think that the decisions delivered by the Inter-American Court have been key for these rulings, because we have had, for example, the Caso Artavia Murillo, where they said basically what the justices said in the case of Sinaloa, and this decision from the Supreme Court couldn't occur if we didn't have as well the decisions from the Inter-American Court.
So there's a question here from the audience, from Jennifer Nelson, who, it's a good follow-up question. She is interested in Mexican feminists' attention to addressing obstetric violence as a way to expand reproductive justice. So could you comment on this aspect of the movement in Mexico?
If you're okay, Camila, I can start and you can, okay, perfect. In GIRE, one of our key subjects we work is obstetric violence, and we see it as a violation to human rights for all the people with the ability to gestate that occur both in public and in private hospitals. So we say, if a maternity motherhood will be desired, or it will not happen, But we have seen that even when motherhood is desired, sometimes the whole structure performs or do things to punish you. For example, if you are poor, if you're an indigenous woman, if you are young, sometimes the doctors do certain things in order to violate your rights. For example, they put in you an contraceptive, for example, an DIU. I don't know how to say that in English.
IUD.
IUD. Yeah, they put an IUD without your consent because they say sometimes, you know what, you have had too many kids. In Mexico, we have one of the highest rates of C-sections because it's easier for physicians to perform a C-section than going through labor. So in Mexico, in GIRE and in the feminist movement, we are saying motherhood must be desired in order to happen, but it also must come from dignified procedures where women can have also labors that are accompanied by someone where they can actually choose how to give birth. You know, all of this comes into our constitutional right of reproductive autonomy. How many kids we want, how many children we want to have, how these children come to this world. All of this is part of the feminist social movement currently.
Camilla, did you want to add anything?
Not really, not on this question. It's a really, really important area to look into and keep fighting for, I think. But yeah.
Okay, let me take our conversation. We've talked a bit about the influence, for example, of the legalization in Argentina, maybe having influenced at least feminists in Mexico to see that protests and mobilization can have some effect. But in these two cases, it's different, right? So in Argentina in 2020 and Uruguay in 2012, it was legalization via legislation. So it was legalization rather than decriminalization. Whereas in Mexico, we have a court case. I'm wondering about what the implications this Mexican decision may have on other countries' courts. We have right now, the Constitutional Court in Colombia is examining a similar question of expanding abortion legality in that country where it's limited to 3 reasons for having abortion. What kind of implications might this decision have in that case or in other cases? I'm asking about a court-to-court decision. And I'm also sort of curious, like, is that the only time we would see influence from court to court, or would a court decision potentially have influence on legislative decisions in other countries?
I think that there might be some kind of spillover effect, if you will. I mean, Melissa already talked about the Inter-American Court for Human Rights, and of course, that is slightly different in that it's a regional court, and there are certain enforcement mechanisms that pushes states to comply with verdicts that are being made. I think it's very hard to tell, of course, the extent to which sort of courts influence courts, but we seem to be looking at perhaps some kind of liberalizing trend through courts that has been not completely unprecedented before. I mean, we do have Colombia's Constitutional Court decision back in 2005 or 6, if I don't misremember, that lifted the complete ban on abortion. So I think what one can say is that courts and the judicialization of issues that are very controversial, such as abortion or same-sex marriage, that is for sure something that is coming very strong. I'm not sure we can talk about a trend here necessarily, but we do see that the courts in Latin America are increasingly taking steps towards regulating these kinds of issues rather than governments or legislatures. I mean, we did see Argentina, we did see Uruguay, but I am not as positive when it comes to legislators pushing these issues through as I am for independent courts. So that would be my first step at that question.
Melissa, did you want to add anything?
I would just say that as I agree completely with what Camila just said, I think there will be a spillover effect, since, for example, in Colombia, the Causa Justa movement currently is asking the Supreme Court in Colombia to state whether abortion can be criminalized through, in the criminal codes, and it's something that the Supreme Court directly in Mexico directly addressed, and they said that criminal codes shouldn't be the ones where the abortion is seen, because the criminal law does not have the ability to guarantee the objective that banning abortion has in the legislator's mind, which is to protect the life of the fetus. So in Mexico, what the Supreme Court said is that if you want that to happen, you have to put abortion in the sanitary administrative laws, where you can say, and you can punish abortion, for example, with other things, not prison, because we know that prison does not abolish the fact that other women will continue to have abortions. So the court said you should invest, for example, in contraceptives. You should invest, for example, in sexual education, and not putting abortion in criminal codes. So I think that perhaps the justices in Colombia might read what the Supreme Court in Mexico said, and hopefully they will use these arguments. In addition, the feminist movement in the Latin American region is really coordinated. So we have had different meetings with our colleagues from Colombia, with our colleagues from Argentina. So hopefully this will have a ripple effect.
So we have time for probably one more question, and I want to circle back to a really important topic that Melissa brought up earlier, which is implementation and actual access. Often across Latin America, we have some beautiful laws on the books on all sorts of different topics, especially ones related to gender equality, whether it's about violence against women or feminist foreign policy, which is another example for Mexico, but which we don't see a lot of action on the ground. And so what is it going to take for abortion to actually be safe abortion, to actually be accessible for Mexican women?
I mean, something that I came across very, very early on when I was doing research in Mexico was that even though, as you said, Christina, there were beautiful laws in place, there was still no access. And a lot of that had to do with that there weren't any sort of protocols for procedures. There were no guidance for example, people in the bureaucracy or in the medical sphere. So actually, in fact, no one really knew how to process a request for an abortion. And clearly, this is very serious, because if you don't have those kinds of procedures or the protocols in place, then a decision cannot be implemented. So clearly that needs to change, and those kinds of protocols must be in place at the state level, at the local level, wherever these decisions are implemented. Melissa also already talked about the liberty of conscience, which is also a big barrier that medical personnel can say, actually, I do not want to perform an abortion, so you cannot have one. And I think it's interesting that in the case of Mexico City, when the state decriminalized abortion back in 2007, there was a particular clause in the law that says that the state must be able to provide medical personnel to carry out abortions, because they knew probably that otherwise many medical personnel would just say no. So those kinds of provisions also need to exist in specific states' laws then for this not to occur. But there is just a myriad of sort of small hurdles that a woman who seeks an abortion has to go through. And given that there's a very limited time in which abortion is legal, for example, in all states due to rape, right? Women should still technically have the possibility to abort. But unless all of those sort of small things like protocols and the willingness of people who are working in the medical sphere, if that is not changing, then these laws will not become implemented at all. And for that to happen, I think there needs to be very, very clear guidelines and laws in place.
Melissa, did you want to add anything to that about implementation?
Yes, I would say that we will have to continue litigating for women to have access to free abortion, because that's something that we also have to talk about. Abortion has to be free in order to be accessible for every woman. Here in Mexico, the poorest are the women. So I think that's also something that the state has to consider. Here we have the judges and the justices have the obligation to rule with gender perspective. And fortunately, in the decision of Coahuila, that's something that they said, that the ones that are the most affected by criminalization of abortion are poor women. So I think that for abortion to become a reality in Mexico, it also has to be accessible for every woman and every person with the ability to gestate.
Yeah, so super important point to end on, because we know that Mexico, Latin America more generally has very, very steep economic inequality. So when we talk about any kind of gender issue, we've really got to be thinking about how it applies to women across economic status. So I want to thank both of you for a really stimulating conversation. I hope that our audience has learned quite a bit. I certainly have, about the Mexican Supreme Court decision and what the steps are ahead in terms of really making abortion accessible to women across Mexico. It's not a far-fetched possibility that Mexico might be the place where Texas women would need to go next for access to abortion, unfortunately. For our audience, anybody who has registered for this, you'll be seeing a email in the next few days with a link to the recorded version of this conversation. It will also be up on the YouTube channel of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. We will also send out with that a link to the report that Melissa mentioned that HIDE has recently published on this topic. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Christina. And it was great to talk to you, Melissa.
Both of you, it was a pleasure to be here today.